Afternoon. So welcome to Dr. Carrey's class, actually seminar on geospatial data navigating environmental sustainability challenges, right? So that's the seminar she's going to deliver to us this afternoon. And you guys all about her, right? She's a professor in this class, and she's also acting director for the ESRC. All right, I have the honor of reading the land and acknowledgement. So bear with me. So Brock University acknowledges the land on which we are gathered in traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of them whom continue to live here today. All right, I said it right. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada treaties and is within the land, land protected by the dish with the spoon bump agreement. Okay, I'm doing it for the first time. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging remind us that our great standard of living is directly related to the sources and friendship of Indigenous people. Right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kamal.
And I hope I did justice to everybody here today.
You did. You did an excellent job. And it's something that we really should have you all do more of because it is a common practice. And it's good for you to practice. And so I realized, okay, I'm solo today. Why not ask one of you? And if I had asked you last week, you probably would have been thinking about it. Now it's just on the spot. So you did a great job. I didn't even ask you to introduce me, and you did. So that's honestly, it takes practice to actually introduce somebody else, right? So we have done that in the past, and I'd like to do that again the next time we teach this course, is to have the students do the intros and the thank yous at the end. Well, we still have a couple more classes, so make it your turn just yet. So thank you, Kamal. Yes, my name is Marilyne Carrey, and I am indeed acting director of the ESRC right now. I'm also an associate professor in the unit, and my research area has been within environmental sustainability, primarily looking at geospatial technologies and how we use those technologies to kind of navigate the environmental sustainability challenges that we face. So that's really the purpose of the talk today, is to share with you first a bit of information about geospatial data, because some of you may not necessarily know what those data are or what they look like. And then secondly, how can we then use those data or collect and analyze those data to extract meaningful information that can then help inform decisions we make about environmental sustainability. And they're just challenges, but opportunities as well. We don't have to wait until there's a problem for us to use these data and geospatial technologies to look at potential solutions. I love this image. It's NASA's Voyager 1 mission, sometimes called the pale blue dot. And I've always looked at it with fondness, and it reminded me a lot of Julia's talk about being an individual, right, in this world, and sometimes that can be really overwhelming. And this is kind of like the opposite perspective, to actually look at, 6 billion kilometers away from the Earth's surface. The Voyager is taking this image, looking back at the Earth, right, as it's getting further away and into interspace. I think it's really cool to imagine. For a moment, you almost feel a little bit like, well, it's kind of underwhelming, like we're that small. I also think it gives us a really unique perspective that, we are really kind of in this alone as a collective globally, right? We're that fragile, we're that tiny a speck. It just depends on the scale that you look at a problem with. And with geospatial technologies, or those data that we use with those technologies, we can actually decide the scale that we want to look at a problem from. That can either be scale in terms of spatial scale, global to local, Or we think about temporal scale, right? What time frame do you want to look at a problem within or from to, right? Or is it just one snapshot in time? So I'll give you a bit of a sense of where we're going here. Ooh, I'm use this keyboard by providing you with an outline. So first we'll talk about geospatial data, and we'll even back up and talk just about data. I love data, so this is my opportunity to talk about data, and you're kind of forced into listening, which I love, because I rarely get to talk about my passion around data, right? And then I'll talk about some of the geospatial technologies that we use to analyze data, some of the applications and uses of the data, and there I'll touch on some of the research that I've been doing, and then I'll get into resources and supports, because you may or may not realize that as a Brock student, you have access to all of these resources that you won't when you graduate, right? And those I think will be really, really helpful to you. Okay, so I'm gonna forward my slide on here too. So let's begin with what are data? And the word data is funny too, because it's actual plural for datum. So I never say the data is. I feel it's wrong to say the data is. So the data are, but basically it's a collection of facts like numbers, words, observations, measurements, pictures, images that can be collected and then examined and used to help in decision making. And data are different from information, but most people use those two words interchangeably, right? I see data as this, and information is what we extract from the data, right? So we apply some kind of statistical analyses or maybe even spatial stats to extract information from data. So it's helpful to just review what are the types of data, right? You learned last year in the methods course, you probably talked a little bit about this. You would have likely had a course on data, maybe even on statistics in your undergrad, where you would have talked about these kind of broad categories of descriptive data versus more qualitative data versus quantitative data. Yes? Okay, so qualitative, I like to just think of as differences in kind. Think of differences in land use, land cover as one example of that, right? Quantitative differences in quantity. And for quantitative data, we actually for both groups, we actually further break those down into what we call the noir principle. Have you heard of this? Noir is the French word for black. It has no relevance except that it forms an acronym: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And we typically say that qualitative data are also on a scale of kind of nominal data, right? Where, again, you only have differences in type or kind. Think of land use and land cover. Ordinal data tends to be more descriptive and on the qualitative side as well. So I use a little example here. Imagine you have a map of areas where you either know they're wet or they're dry. You don't know anything more than that. If you move to ordinal scale of data measurement, then we're now talking about, we know the wettest to the driest by number. So maybe cities are ranked by wet to dry, but you have no idea what the interval is between those measurements, okay? So those are ordinal scale data. Interval ratio scale data are those data where you actually have a zero starting point. So think of centimeters as a good example. So imagine these data are rainfall data, and now you know that those areas, originally you just knew that this was a wet area, then you knew it was the wettest area in the region, and now you know that they get an average of, let's say, 10.2 centimeters of rain, you know, in a month period or something like that, right? So interval and ratio scale data are normally grouped together, and those data are typically quantitative, right, continuous data sets. Does that make sense? Is this ringing a bell? So what's important about noir, and this applies to spatial data too, but what's important about noir is it actually then tells you what statistical data analyses can be performed on your data, right? So it's really important to know the scale of measurement of your data, and that applies to the spatial world too. So, a bit of fun. Here's my little dog Andy, named after Craig Anderson, who used to be the goalie for the Ottawa Senators. I inherited this dog from my sister, who bought a puppy and then decided, what was I thinking? And so she gave it to me before I knew anything about puppies. But man, is he cute. So in a non-spatial world, we can think of qualitative data, like the color of, for example, his fur, right? We can think about his leash, the color of his leash. Those are all descriptions, right? Measures of that picture that we're looking at. Quantitatively, we can divide these data into discrete and continuous, where we can say Andy has 2 eyes, Andy has 4 legs, he has 1 tail. Or we can talk about continuous data sets, the interval ratio scale data, like he weighs 5 pounds, he's 25 centimeters tall, right? He's now much older, he's like 7 years old now, and now my sister has him back. I was like, that dog that you gave me that I inherited before I knew what puppies, what havoc they can wreak on a household. Andy did not love COVID and would bark at our doors, and so my sister got the dog back. I loved Andy, but he still sees us now, but not as much. But he is awfully cute, isn't he? So imagine that we now strap a little device into a harness and put it onto Andy, right? We can now create spatial data by strapping that device onto Andy and have him wander around, and this is fictitious. Andy couldn't walk very far. He could never follow me on a 5K, not at all. But this is the idea that this is actually one device that we use. It's a geospatial device, call it a global positioning system. And people often, they're in all of our phones, they're in our cars, and we can also strap them on animals, right? And then we can actually map out spatially where Andy's been, right? Now we're looking at spatial data. We're actually looking at those lines that are really dots connected by lines, superimposed onto a satellite image of this particular area. So we can talk again about those qualitative data. Think about the land use, land cover types that you see, right? There's residential areas, there's forested areas, land uses and land covers, right? That are really mostly just nominal scale descriptive data. Or we can go all the way to quantitative interval ratio scale data. What is the area occupied by trees only in this image, right? Which is really helpful when we're trying to think about the biomass amount in an area, or how much an area has kind of urban tree canopy, right? So now we're starting to get into the more sort of quantitative, the geospatial data. Geospatial data can be qualitative or quantitative as well. There's just a spatial component. So these are related to or denoting data that are simply associated with a location on the Earth's surface. So all of the data that you acquire have, for example, a latitude, longitude, or a geographic coordinate attached to it, right? So often we just say spatial data and spatial stats, but when we use geospatial technologies to collect those data, then they're called geospatial data, and we even use the word called geospatial statistics, right? When I'm talking today, I think it's important to think about the fact that these data have a spatial component just like kind of other data that you might experience, right? So think about, for example, if you had a CAT scan done of your body, or maybe even just a scan of your head, then it's producing the same kind of information that we use here, only we're studying the condition of the Earth instead of the condition of the body, right? In some cases, using these data. Okay, so Geospatial data, often they behind the scenes look like something like this. For example, this is data acquired from a GPS unit, a handheld instrument that you can actually acquire your latitude, longitude coordinates. So Andy's running around, we can take measurements at so many points in time, or we can have a handheld device and take measurements at unique points on the Earth's surface. So we can just label those as unique ID 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we can start looking at mapping whatever we happen to be interested in. I'm very interested in tree species. I love to know what species were here originally, what species have been introduced, right? Think about the tree of heaven, for example, is a non-native species here in the region, and it's a massive host for the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that is really attracted to grapevines and other agricultural crops and can cost billions of dollars to the local economy, right? And it's already been spotted across the border, but that's one example where you can actually, take an individual tree, for example, from that image I showed you in the last slide, and then now start recording measurements from that tree. What's its height? What's its age? Is there any signs of disease that you can visually see on the plant, etc., right? So those are simply data that have lat-long coordinates or some other coordinates attached to them that basically tell you where is this on the Earth's surface. So those are geospatial data. So what are geospatial technologies? So they're basically different high-tech systems that are used to analyze, acquire, store, manage various types of location-based data. And I would say that the three most common geospatial technologies that you've probably heard about before would be GPS, global positioning systems, that handheld device, or sometimes handheld, sometimes it's in your car, your cell phone. But we actually have very expensive, precise and accurate devices that you can spend $10,000 or $20,000 on to get really accurate GPS data from remote sensing. That's mostly from satellites, airborne systems like aircraft or even drone systems, and also in situ from the Earth directly using a handheld instrument. You can collect remote sensing data, and then there's some geographic information systems. We can add other technologies, VR, for example, etc., AI, but these are primarily the three main types of geospatial technologies that are used to look at environmental sustainability issues that we face today. They're very commonly used, but you need to know a little bit about them so that they're not misused, right? So here's a graphic that just shows you remote sensing, GPS. There's satellites involved in collecting GPS data, but remote sensing data are acquired by satellites all the way to drones and handheld devices. And then geographic information systems tend to get all the attention. They even get a day of the year. Usually in the third week of November, we have GIS Day, which always upsets me greatly because I love remote sensing. I think it's the technology that's the best, right? I should have mentioned that first slide of the blue dot was taken February 14th, 1990, the same year I fell in love with remote sensing. I'm just saying. Yep. So in my classes, when I taught undergrad remote sensing courses, it was always in the winter. And February 14th, the class would be that week or that day. If it was that day, it was a big thing. But I would always order in cookies and donuts, and we would celebrate my love for remote sensing. Okay, another side.
Valentine's Day too.
Yes, it is. Yes, yes, come on. Yes, I thought you would see the connection. Look, I have to tell you a funny story. So I fell in love with remote sensing, and then I learned about this man, John Jensen. And John Jensen studied wetland ecosystems, my second passion, right? And I was just astounded, like, wow. And so I read everything I could about John Jensen. Then I went to grad school at Waterloo and met my friend Tracy Fell. And Tracy was from the University of South Carolina. And John Jensen was from that university. And she was like, yeah, I know John Jensen. But she didn't do remote sensing. She just knew of him. So one time I got the chance to go to the Association of American Geographers meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we stayed at Tracy's mom's house in South Carolina. And we went and visited USC. And we were going down the hallway, and she's like, oh, by the way, that's John Jensen. And I was like, and I couldn't bring myself to introduce myself. There was my one chance. I was so starstruck that I never met this man that I have loved for like decades now. Decades. Since 1990, I have loved this man. Anyway, I should probably tell him one day, but he wrote textbooks and he's like, reading his stuff is like poetry to me. It's so funny. Anyway, yeah. So I will share more of that love. But so those are the technologies, and now I want to go through each one and give you, as I go through, I'm going to give you some examples as well that will kind of highlight some of the work that's being done in terms of environmental sustainability. And don't worry, unlike my second-year undergrad students, I'm not going to dissect this for you. You probably saw a diagram like this in high school geography class, or maybe in uni in a class where you talked about latitude, longitude. These are just angular measurements of our position on the Earth's surface. Here's an example from St. Catharines, right? We can also use and do use a metric system of measurements, but I'm not going to get into those details. We can do that one-on-one if you wanted to. But we essentially use this handheld device. Trimble's a great example. That was actually a $10,000 unit way back in the early 2000s. What's lovely about those units is that not only can you take measurements, so imagine yourself in a forest, urban forest, plotting out the trees, or imagine yourself in a vineyard. And I did this when I was pregnant for Ethan. I went out into a vineyard and collected data from every fourth vine, across every fourth vine, I think, or fourth row, and every fourth vine. So we did some sampling of vines and collected those points. In the past, I would have taken tape in the field with me and taped every fourth vine in every fourth row, right? And then I would have the problem of either animals or people that are working in the field pretty regularly removing those taped or tagged vines. Similarly, tagging trees can be really problematic. You can make errors, right? Whereas here with a handheld device, you go, to point A, take the measurements, it has a unique ID number, and that will stay with it forever. And then you go to point 2, point 3, right? Then you go back out into the field, sometime into the future, maybe it's over the growing season, for example, you're collecting all kinds of attribute information about the thing that you're studying. So if it's a tree, you're looking at age, species type. If it's a vine, we were looking at the condition of the vine. We actually took grapes from the vines so that we could talk about berry composition. We took spectral measurements, which we'll talk about in a minute. We took measurements of soil moisture as well, right? And we could attribute all of those non-spatial data to a specific location on the Earth's surface. Just super cool, right? So we can go back out, and this system will actually navigate us to point number 1. It'll bring us right back to that point. Okay, we're back at that vine, and now let's collect those same data. Has anything changed? Has it stayed the same? So, for example, soil moisture, has that changed over time, or is it temporally stable? So, very helpful instrument. You can use instruments that aren't $10,000. It just means that maybe your location will not be as precise. And again, it's important when you use a tool like this to think, do I need that level of precision? So Here we were looking at, less than 10 centimeter data, and yes, we needed that precision to map it out with the satellite data that were about 10 centimeter, just under 10 centimeter data. And we use drone data too that can get very high spatial resolution data, right? So you need to be really accurate. So here, data points are collected by a GPS unit. So there's just an example. Here's the actual example from the field that we looked at. This was 3 different Chardonnay, Franc, Cab Franc, and Chardonnay sites at Stratus Vineyard in Niagara region. And each of those points has a unique ID and geographic number. When you look at the blue dots, they're dots where we took extra measurements. We looked at the leaf water potential for leaves, etc., so that we could collect statistics about those data and look at how they change over time. What's lovely is often when we collect data using a geospatial technology, we often couple it with other technologies. So something as simple as then taking those point data and superimposing them onto a satellite backdrop image as a backdrop or an air photo as a backdrop allows us to now display it to others, right? When we get those data, they're normally just points floating in space, right? So we can actually tie those down using this image as a backdrop so that people looking at it can go, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? So we can give it some spatial context. So this was a really fun study, actually. I enjoyed this study a lot. Okay, so when we return back, that's just to show you what GPS data kind of look like. And then we'll talk about their application and use in a moment. So what does remote sensing look like? You know that's my favorite technology. There should be a day assigned. I think it's funny that it is still February. I should have brought you cookies and donuts today. That would have really shown the love, right? Okay, well, maybe next time. But remote sensing, the definition, this is a little Kiefer and Chipman, not John Jensen, but he has a good definition too. But I think it's interesting that we talk about it as the science and art of obtaining information about an object area phenomenon. So think about atmospheric phenomenon or climate and activity in the atmosphere. Through the analysis of data acquired by a device, that's a remote sensing device, that's not in contact with the object area phenomena under investigation, right? So in a kind of non-geospatial world, think about Ethan was at the dentist this morning and he had some x-rays taken, right? That's an excellent example of remote sensing. It's just not that we're using it for Earth observation, right? So today I'm focusing on using it for Earth observation. You're actually conducting remote sensing right now by reading this slide, and that energy, electromagnetic energy being reflected off a page in a book or this screen is allowing your visual system that operates only in kind of colors blue, green, and red to interpret this information. Some people tend to get thermal or heat energy kind of confused as though it's all remote sensing is just thermal imaging, and it's not. Thermal imaging is only a part of remote sensing, like what we look at for Earth observation. But technically, if you were to hold your hand above a stove element, for example, again, you're not in contact, but you're physically sensing that energy. Same idea. So often we have a satellite or an aircraft that's above the Earth's surface. It's normally detecting energy that's either reflected off the Earth's surface from the sun or it's emitted, right? So it's either energy is coming from the sun to the Earth, takes about 8 minutes, it interacts with the atmosphere, it interacts with the Earth object, and then it bounces back into the atmosphere where a remote sensing device can capture that energy. A lot of that energy is reflected energy, but some of it just comes passively emitted from the Earth's surface. And that's like heat energy as an example, right? And that helps to build what we can see here is an image of the Earth's surface. This is actually Teal House. Sorry if you can't see it that well, but and this is an image that contains a couple different parts of the spectrum, the same parts your eyes operate within. So blue, green, and red energy is being used and combined together to produce this true color composite image. If we actually peeled away and looked behind those data, we would find a couple, 3 of these with, these are the pixels, picture elements become pixels in remote sensing, kind of like a TV set, where you have these numeric data that are representing solar energy that's being reflected or emitted from the Earth's surface. So there'd be one for the blue, one for the green, one for the red. They'd be combined to produce this color composite image. You with me? So you're already seeing, I feel like you've got the love mostly for remote sensing. So the electromagnetic spectrum sounds really horrible. It's just like a ruler, really, with very short measurements on one end and very long on the other. And then we're just demarcating sizes of wavelengths. The energy coming from the sun is moving in waveform. There's other theories, but we're going with the waveform theory. And the distance from one wave peak to the next is the wavelength. So this ruler just tells you super short wavelengths. We get into a little bit longer, then into centimeters, and eventually meters. This part of the spectrum is the part that we care about for observing the Earth. The other parts on this side mostly used in medicine, right? Think of X-ray, this is not my X-ray, but X-rays, for example. I think it's cool, though, that we can talk about imaging that we primarily use in medicine, or we use it to observe the Earth, right? And the condition of both, condition of the human body or condition of the Earth's surface, right? Here again is an example of an image that's in the visible part of the spectrum, so we all see that energy, right? From the blue, green, red part of the spectrum. This looks really weird, because I'm now actually incorporating other parts of the spectrum and giving them the color, blue, green, and red. So now you're like, whoa, what is that? Now we're incorporating the near infrared part of the spectrum, and this becomes what we call a standard false color composite image. And false color composite images include only reflected green, red, and near infrared energy, and we drop the blue. And it actually produces much richer information visually, too, but also in the numeric data of the Earth's surface, especially when it involves vegetation. So we use the near-infrared part of the spectrum to tell us a lot about species of vegetation, about the health of the vegetation. So a lot of information about plants comes from that part of the spectrum. And different parts of the spectrum give us different bits of info. So, for example, we can then move on again from the reflected infrared to the thermal infrared, right? Now we can use this information to tell us a lot about forest fires. And wildfires, you know, have been a big problem over the last year and a half, right? So we can use that imagery to actually cut through the smoke and the flames to actually see in parts of the spectrum that our eyes don't operate. Other animals do. There's some great CBC documentaries about color and color theory, and you'll learn that, you know, snakes have a different visual system, which is really quite interesting. But now, with this technology, we can actually produce color composite images that show us not just the active fire area, but the edge around the fire. Coupled with information about wind direction, etc., we can start now managing that fire, predicting where that fire is moving, what direction it's moving in, etc., right? So in terms of, think about climate change and environmental sustainability, like that's a really useful tool. A lot of drones have been used for that purpose, even to kind of recover firefighters that have been lost in fires. One thing I really love about the technology is it helps us understand environmental sustainability, but it's also a practice that can be somewhat sustainable in that we're not actually going in and disrupting habitat, etc. There are also some parts of the world that are inaccessible, right? Due to war, due to the fact that, like, think of the Florida Everglades, for example. I love wetlands, not getting out of a boat there to do any kind of field work, right? So that's an important piece. But here, the radar part of the spectrum also, again, gives us very different looking data. We can look at these images as just grayscale images, or we can combine them with other parts of the spectrum to look at color composite images. And usually, different parts of the spectrum provide us with complementary data sets. So that's pretty cool. So that's remote sensing. I showed you those numeric data. Those numeric data are basically coming from this, what we call a spectral reflectance curve. And each Earth surface feature has, like us, a unique fingerprint, a unique spectral reflectance curve. So here's an example of very healthy vegetation that has a very unique spectral reflectance curve, and that's what allows us to differentiate it from unhealthy vegetation, etc., right? So if we just isolate this part of the spectrum, now you can see how vegetation, when it's healthy, appears green to us, to our eyes, because we're not getting as much reflectance from the blue and red parts of the spectrum. So we mostly see vegetation as green. As soon as there's a problem with the vegetation, it drops in reflectance from the near infrared, but we don't see that with our eyes, right? Instead, we might eventually notice that we're getting a little bit more red, and we start going to the yellow, green and red starts giving us this yellow, and then eventually a brownish color to vegetation. And by then, it's too late for us to do anything. So remote sensing is cool in that it could be like an early warning system that there's something wrong with the vegetation. And that could be really useful information in the agricultural sector, in vineyards too, which I've used it for. So lastly, we've got geographic information systems. And these are systems that are computer systems, like ArcGIS is one example, where you can take those GPS data, those remote sensing data, and bring those and other data sets into one platform. And that's why it gets all the love. So you can do everything there, but some really sophisticated data analyses aren't yet there for GIS. So remote sensing software can be used to do those more sophisticated data analyses, and then you can pull those results into a GIS environment. So it is super useful, but GIS, remote sensing and GPS can also operate on their own. Okay, so here's an example for you. I'll get into some applications now just to show you what I'm referring to. Here's an example where you have the GPS data. So we went out into the field, and I'm only going to use one variable we collected was soil moisture on September 19th, 2008. And we collected many variables, as I mentioned, but soil was one of them. So that's what the Excel spreadsheet looked like. And spreadsheets are really hard to look at and get a sense of what are the patterns, what are the trends in your data. And that's why it can be really helpful to use these technologies, even to just visualize what do those patterns look like, right? So just some examples, this top left image just shows you those point data. But now when we add information to those points, right, the amount of soil moisture, for example, now we see a dot distribution map that shows us a little bit more. Oh, I can see where one field, like CF2, is much wetter than CH1, I think we call it, yeah. And so the pattern of soil moisture in an area where actually the elevation is not that different. It looks like a flat field, but you realize quickly it's not that flat, right? And so we could actually then take those point data and use interpolation techniques and kind of spread that out and then divide up those soil moisture measurements into either low or high, right? And start to look at the patterns that emerged here. Now, when we then take those and plot that over time, now we can start to see not only spatial patterns, but trends temporally as well. And so we actually looked at over time, and think about irrigation and the use of water in agriculture is a massive challenge for us right now, right? When many parts of the globe are really strapped in terms of availability of water, right? So thinking carefully about creating zones of soil moisture and then irrigating based on that, rather than just treating these fields as uniform, is really important. So we can now target our management. That also means that maybe we're not putting as many chemicals into the environment that are then running off into local water bodies. We can also use remote sensing technology, for example, to assess plant condition. And I give you a few different ways that we can do that, where again, we can look at these spectral reflectance curves for different species or different plants of the same species, but one's healthy, one's stressed, and we can try and then address those issues. Is it maybe a nutrient deficiency? Is it water deficiency? Is it disease? Here's an example from Niagara. This was a paper that was published not that long ago from us looking at a virus, leaf roll associated virus. I'm not going to get into lengthy names, but you could actually visually see that disease, but not all diseases present themselves that way. So if we can have an early warning system to let us know when there's a problem, that can be really helpful and save a lot of money. So one criticism of the technology is that we're using it and it's really expensive, but at the same time, if it helps us, predict or even look at where there might be potential problems, it could also save a lot of money. So a similar study, we use drone data here. This was just published in January, which is awesome. Bree worked hard. She's a Ph.D. now at York, and we worked together extensively to put together this paper with a couple other colleagues. And we looked at how we could use the technology to give us a good idea of the health of the yield and berry composition. And some of the wine was actually even tasted by others, so we can actually get into the quality of the wines coming from these areas, right? So, so we really had some interesting results coming from that, but we can do and have done similar studies in agricultural contexts. Okay, I'm watching the time here, so I'm going to spend the kind of rest talking about wetland ecosystems, and then we'll talk about the resources and supports. I think many of you probably realize Canada is home to about 25% of the global, total global resource base. Wetlands obviously require protection, and if we don't know where they are, it's going to be awfully hard to protect them. And we can use remote sensing data to do that as one way to do that, which is fantastic. And so that's what we did. This is an area just near south of Cambridge, near South Dumfries Township. For those who may not know, in southern Ontario and in other parts of Canada, but especially southern Ontario, where we're rich in wetlands, at least we were, we've lost a significant portion, about 70% of original wetland. Toronto is now situated on a huge wetland, so is Windsor, and other cities, which causes flooding and all kinds of other problems. But we've been susceptible to obviously changes in climate, dredging and stream channelization, clearing these lands for agriculture, urbanization. Pollution has been a problem as well. And then, of course, we've got issues like invasive species. Phragmites is one example, and purple loosestrife is another. Phragmites is particularly problematic. So here's some data that we acquired over South Dumfries Township. This was from a little Cessna aircraft, and these data are about 1 meter pixel sizes on the ground, 1 meter by 1 meter, which is pretty high resolution. And we use those data to then actually map out the land use land covers in the area. Again, if we don't know where those wetlands are, how can we protect them? And it's not just shoreline wetlands. We tend to focus a lot on shoreline or even coastal wetlands. But we also have a significant portion of inland wetland ecosystems that we need to protect as well. So these are land use land cover data that include different types of wetlands. In Canada, we have marshes, swamps, bogs, fens, and shallow open water are classified as wetland. And this now tells us, okay, where are these wetlands located and what's happening in adjacent areas? So quiz now, first question on the quiz is, what level of measurement are these data? Nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio scaled data?
Nominal, right?
Absolutely. Land use land cover. So I'm just showing you differences in type. We can calculate the area covered by wetlands, swamps, marshes, and now that could be interval ratio scaled data, right? But this map itself is nominal scaled data. Just because it's the lower level of measurement, don't equate that with it's less than. This is really useful information, and we can couple it with other quantitative data, right? So bear that in mind. One challenge that we have more recently, as you know, a huge problem in environmental sustainability is biodiversity loss. Again, remote sensing has played an important role in dealing with biodiversity loss. Some of the ground-based measures that we could apply, like species richness counts in 1 by 1 meter plots on the ground, for example, are awesome, but they don't always give us the information spatially. We just know that in that grid, there were 5 different species or 3 different species. We don't always know geographically where are they on the landscape. So I undertook a study with a couple of colleagues to then look at that piece of information as well. So quantitatively, not just what is the pixel, it's let's say marsh pixel, but what's beside that pixel, right? And so we looked at this study, and I can send you the paper if you're interested, to look at basically homogeneity or heterogeneity in the landscape. And homogeneity means like everything is homogeneous or one of the same. And we tend to get that where there's a loss of biodiversity. One species is kind of dominating the landscape. So we were looking for more heterogeneity, and we did find a reasonable bit of heterogeneity in the landscape as well. So it's something we can think of again. It's a piece of information we've extracted from these data to help in our management efforts, right? Around looking at biodiversity loss. Phragmites is a huge invasive, Phragmites australis, there is a native equivalent, but one of the types of Phragmites, and some of you recognize this photo from Niagara Falls, where they've been managing Phragmites in wetland areas or areas that are in ditches. This was a ditch filled with a bit of water, where they were managing with 48 goats, which we thought was super cool, as a different way versus chemical application of chemicals to kind of eliminate these invasive species that clog drains and create all kinds of challenges for us. They result in biodiversity loss, and in wetlands, they're a massive problem in this part of the world. So we can use the technology, again, remote sensing, to actually then detect where the Phragmites plants in the landscape so that we can better manage those plants. And again, you see that their spectral reflectance characteristics are very different, and that's how we identify them and extract that information from remote sensing data. So that's another cool paper. I wasn't part of that paper, but I wish I was. So what are some of the benefits, challenges, and emerging trends? Huge benefits are, of course, precise and accurate baseline data from which we can then monitor over time. This can help us thinking about our management efforts, whether they're successful or not. So measuring outcomes is an important piece of what we can do with remote sensing or GIS data sets. These data combined with other data sets to help us solve the problems that we face. We can cover large geographic areas using these data, so we can think about the scale, spatial and temporal scale that we want to look at. Some challenges are you need expertise, there's costs, accuracy is always an issue, and then accessibility of the data for other populations, right? And those are big issues. The one way that we can kind of help with this is to look at higher education institution partnerships. So I've recently partnered, for example, the Brock Lincoln Living Lab was a partnership between the town of Lincoln and Brock to look at mapping their urban tree canopy. I didn't really talk about that work here, but that was a lot of fun and bringing together. So now I have the expertise with a student of mine, and now the town of Lincoln can work together with us to help provide us with their tree canopy data. We add to it, we analyze those remote sensing data that we acquired here at Brock. So that saved them money, right? To try and pool resources and leverage our resources to address some of these challenges. Lastly, right now AI is huge, and machine learning in remote sensing and GIS and all geospatial technologies. We're seeing quite a huge increase in high resolution data. Those are like the really detailed images that we get, for example. And then advancements in data visualization techniques as well. A lot of animation, for example, which is hard to capture in papers. So there are a lot of good reasons to use these technologies. There's a lot of papers now coming out about how these technologies can help us to address some of these challenges that we face, right, and some of these goals. Not all of them. Often you'll find there's some criticism of geospatial technologies or geospatial data as kind of like solutions looking for problems. That's really not the case. They don't solve all problems, but they can be used to help collect the data and the evidence that we need to help solve these kind of the missing pieces of the puzzles that we're looking at. I note that a lot of people argue that they offer observation and analyses that are unbiased. I'm hard against that. So I'm going to always know, because at the end of the day, again, you're using NOIR, you're deciding what data analysis techniques you're applying to the data, how you clean up the data, for example, all those different decisions you make about spatial and temporal scale and what remote sensing device and who's working on it, how many people are, like all of those pieces include human elements that we can't deny are biased. So I just keep that in mind. But they do offer this ability to kind of go across borders, right? And provide us with information that we wouldn't maybe otherwise have. Okay, in terms of resources and supports, there are a plethora of resources here at Brock in the Maps Data and GIS Library. Sharon Jansen is a great resource. If you even wanted to produce a map of anything that you're working on now, a lot of these sites will give you the data sets, and even some will produce the maps that you might need. And then you could talk to someone like Sharon or myself to actually then look at, okay, is this a sound map? Or am I doing what Mark Monmonier suggests is to mislead with maps? So he actually will teach you in this great read how to lie with maps. And maps have been around longer than most of us ever have. They're documents that are found way back in time that are incredibly useful to us, right? But we need to know how to use them. just like geospatial technologies, we also need to know how to use them. We've heard the stories about people following, my husband Bill will follow the GPS in the opposite direction. And I'll be like, okay, we're supposed to go south and we're going north. Yeah, I just want to know where it's going to bring us. It's actually bringing us on a giant loop back to where we're supposed to go. Well, I just want to see where, okay, like, oh my goodness, right? People have ran into water bodies, etc., because they've just relied on a technology, a piece of geospatial technology. So I don't want to have them have a bigger, bad rap, right? We still always need to question, is this data what we might expect, right? Are these results, right? Am I actually going in the right direction, right? So I can at least work on Ethan for now. But anytime you want to go through any of those, these are some more really cool sites. I also found a cool site that will tell you what to do with different data sets, qualitative, quantitative, spatial analyses. And I can't find it for some reason, but I will provide it to you if I'm able to find it. But some of these are really, really fantastic resources for you to explore. So, thank you. You let me talk about my love for remote sensing. We've gone through the kind of introduction to the technologies. How do we use those to then extract information that we need to solve some of the challenges we face? We've gone through some of the resources and supports, and I'm happy to talk one-on-one about those. I would strongly encourage you to think about, exploring these more, especially while you're at Brock and you have access to these resources. There are a few people that go into the job market with any understanding of these kinds of graphical products that are not going away anytime soon, right? So understanding something as simple as how to produce a map can be a really valuable piece to put on your CV. So that's my pitch to you. So thank you. And I'll take questions.